Welcome to the Shared Practices Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Richard Lowe. Just a quick kidney stone update. No baby yet. We had a false alarm, though. Back to the ER for some more pain meds. And we have a name, actually, from Jason Wood himself from last episode. His suggestion was Ruth. So, little baby Ruth. Chris's kidney stone may or may not happen any day now. I also had a question from some listeners about which podcast app I'd recommend. Because if you have the default Apple podcast app, you can only speed it up to certain increments. So I really like Pocket Casts. It's $3 or $4, I can't remember, on iTunes or on Android. The things I love about it, you can go from 1.1, you can go in 0.1 increments, so you can listen to it at 1.4 or 1.7, depending on who's speaking. Some people are really hard to understand when you speed them up, so you can't speed them up as much. All the way up to 3.0. And then they have an up next feature as well. So if you've got like 4 podcasts that you love and you want to listen to these ones first, and then that one sounds interesting, you can throw it in on your up next playlist. So it gives you kind of a working playlist you can set up for yourself. And it's attractive, easy to use. Like I said, cross-platform. You can get it on iOS or on Android. So Pocket Casts. I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. And then there was an email I got from a student, a dental student at UIC. His name is Lawal. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he had a request. And I think we're going to deliver on this one if you guys can help me out. So he says, the recent trend in dentistry seems to be heading in the direction of DSOs. Most dental students, including me, are seriously considering one of the popular DSOs like Heartland and Aspen after graduation. It would be great if you had a speaker with previous experience in any of the corporate chains to talk in great detail, working hours, compensation, production goals, pros and cons, about what it is like working, since recruiters never really tell you the truth. So I love this idea. As I read this email, I thought to myself, you know what, we can do better. Rather than just having 1 or 2 guests on, what if we had people send in a review of their corporate experience? So you can email me, richard@sharedpractices.com, with a review. And I really want the full spectrum, good and bad. I want to know, because within any given chain, there's going to be some great clinics and some not so great clinics. And a lot of that's going to be determined by the people you're with, and maybe the local market conditions, and maybe the personality type of the person in that job position. So I don't think that any one chain is going to be awful and any one chain is going to be perfect. There's going to be pros and cons to all of these. But it would be kind of cool to see if there's any trends that people really did not like this part of this chain, and that kind of pops up from review to review. So if you right now or in the past have worked at a corporate chain, or you know someone who has had a good or a bad experience, reach out to that person and say, hey, I'm listening to this podcast and they're looking for reviews of corporate chains. You can do this anonymously. We don't have to include any information about you. Just email me or forward an email from a buddy. Like if we can get more people, more data, it's going to be a more useful guide. So I want to put it together as a big guide that we could download and share, and we can update it over time. So we can have version 1, version 2, and we'll send out an email every time we get a big enough update to justify that. And then if there's anyone who is ambitious and wants to send in an audio clip, it's as easy as pulling up your phone, going into like an audio recording app. I think Apple has one built in. I'm assuming Android has one built in. If not, you could probably download a third-party one, record a little audio summary of your experience, and either Dropbox it to me or Google Drive, whatever you want to do. Send me a link. And if we get some good ones, I'd love to have them on the show, and maybe even some of those people we could interview and ask some more questions in depth. So I think this is going to be a huge resource for people who are considering corporate options and want to make the most of their time, the most of their experience. They don't want to compromise. They don't want to, lower their standards. They want to do good dentistry and use this as a springboard towards practice ownership. So please, 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 please help us out. This would be awesome. And my buddy was like, you're going to be, if Jason Wood is public enemy number one, you're going to be the poster child of public enemy. I don't want to be the enemy of any corporate chain. I want to be a useful source of objective information. And reviews are never completely objective. Let's be honest. You get on Yelp or Amazon, there's always going to be some biased ones or some negative ones or some, hopefully not some paid ones. I hate these stupid Amazon ads that are obviously, I was given a free version of this product for review, and there's like 400 of those. I will not buy any product that's happened to. Okay, I'm rambling. We have Dr. Mark Costes today. Many of you know him because he interviewed me on his podcast, and so some of you might even be coming from his podcast to ours. If that's the case, you already know that he is the real deal. He has multiple offices himself that he's bought and sold. Right now, I think, in the interview, he just said it, and I just listened to it. I think it's like 8 that he has. He wants to pick up 5 more next year. He lectures, he shares via podcast. He has a mastermind group. He has an annual meeting. He's got like 7 jobs that he's created for himself. And he's kind of a role model to me in that way, and an inspiration in the amount of usefulness and great content that he puts out. So this interview is a continuation of this conversation and idea of who should and shouldn't own a dental practice, and also his take on what his journey would be from new grad to ownership. And it's a little different than what we've gotten so far. So super excited. Here we go, Dr. Mark Costes. So I've got with me here Dr. Mark Costes. Mark, thank you for coming on and talking with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dr. Richard.
Hey, no problem. And just call me Richard. Okay. With this podcast, one of the things we're trying to do in season 1 is address this issue of the fear of practice ownership. So you graduate with $300,000, $400,000 in student loans. You're still not super confident in your clinical skills, your diagnostic skills. There's a lot of competition. Running a business seems very daunting. And it feels very safe to just say, you know what, I'm just going to be an associate. And that can quickly turn into a long-term, nothing wrong with being an associate and getting some experience under your belt. But very quickly, someone can get settled into that and procrastinate moving into practice ownership.
Right.
And I think sometimes it's even a question of, is practice ownership still worth it? And so I wanted to ask you, if you were to talk with someone who was not sold on the idea that our generation, my generation of new grads and new dentists should still own their practices despite all of the things that are going on today, what would you say to that new grad who is unconvinced about practice ownership?
Well, first, let me tell you, I don't believe that practice ownership is for everybody.
Okay.
I honestly don't. I think that there are certain types of personalities that are better suited to be an associate, to be an employee for the rest of their life. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm just saying that I totally believe that it's better for some people. I have a lot of classmates and schoolmates that I graduated within a couple of years of at Marquette that have stayed associates and working in large groups for their entire career. And they're totally happy with that because they realized about their personality that they wouldn't be a good manager. They wouldn't be a good owner. They are risk averse, and it would just make them too uncomfortable to extend out, more debt, and it's just not for them.
Perfect.
So for those people, I do believe that it's probably better that you find the best employee situation that you can. Be really smart about, living within your means and saving for the future. I think that's the best way to go because you're not going to have the benefit of the equity position that you'll have if you actually own your own dental practice. That's not necessarily a bad thing because I know a lot of people that own dental practices and are, approaching the end of their career, haven't run the business correctly. And some of their colleagues that have been associates their entire career are doing better than them financially. So
Okay, so this is great. We're gonna do a quick sidetrack, and then we'll come back to that original question. Then, what are some of the personality traits that you've seen that would make someone say, you know what, maybe ownership isn't for me? So how would I know if it's just gonna be too hard, it's gonna be too much stomach lining that I'm gonna lose, or my personality might steer me away from practice ownership?
Sure. So we all know that we didn't, as a profession in general, most of us did not get an acceptable level of business training,
Right.
right?
Not at all.
Not at all. If any, very little, if any. So if you are so disinterested in the business side of things and you're not willing to put in the time to learn about how to run an effective business, then you probably aren't suited to be a practice owner.
A lot of people feel the
Um,
pressure that, oh, I'm a dentist, I should own my own practice.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to, expectations, societal expectations. If people constantly hear that, you should go out and get your own practice, this is what you should do. Maybe they might be pushed into something that they're not comfortable doing. If you want to dedicate your life to either say being an educator within our profession or really want to sink your teeth into being the best clinician that you can, and you want to travel around and you want to build your surgical skills, and you want to increase your suite of clinical skills to the nth degree, and business ownership and all that goes into that just doesn't fit into that plan, then
Don't do it.
maybe you'll be a great associate your whole life. There's no shame in that.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Because there's so many different ways to be a dentist. So number one characteristic, if the clinical side of dentistry is the only thing you're interested in, and you know that about yourself, then don't feel like you have to.
Yeah.
So are there any other personality traits that you would say you'd be hesitant to recommend that person go into ownership? Like someone, you mentioned risk averse earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of this is something that people can overcome? I can hire an office manager to take over the business side of things and me not worry about the business at all. And how much of that is deluding myself that I don't have to understand anything and they'll take care of everything?
Yeah, risk aversion is a big one. If it makes you physically ill to
Right.
think about taking out more debt, and you are coming and operating from a space of fear, you'll never spread your wings. You'll never be able to get past that. I really believe that. But I think you can work through that risk aversion. But you have to come into this thing fully armed.
Okay.
You have to know what you're getting yourself into. What was the second part of that question?
The second part of that was how much of this, I don't want to run a business, I'm risk averse, can I hire out, bring in an office manager and a team that can run the business systems so I don't have to? Is that a fantasy that, like, if I don't care about learning how to run a business at all, I can still be successful if I just find the right people to do that for me? Or really, do I need to understand it so that I can hire the right people? And I can't just stick my head in a clinical hole and say, hey, I don't care about the business. You guys take care of that. I'm going to take care of the dentistry.
I really like the way this conversation is going. So Michael Gerber would call that delegation versus abdication.
Okay.
Now, abdication would be, I don't want to know anything about business. I'm going to assemble the best team possible, and I'm going to put them in charge of all of my business, and I'm going to be a clinician, and I'm going to bury my head in the operatory, and I'll come out in 40 years.
Sure.
That is abdication, and that is a recipe for disaster.
Okay.
You have got to understand that you're going to have a certain level of business acumen in order to own a business practice. Now, I have lots and lots of clients that have abdicated their business to office managers and support teams and CEOs their entire career, and typically speaking, the vast majority of the time, that is a recipe for disaster. Occasionally, you'll find a unicorn where the doctor found the right person, put them in the right seat on the bus, and that person has been able to run the business for that doctor successfully for their entire career. That's what everybody hopes for, but it's not reality.
Okay.
Most times we have turnover. Most times we have people that are not suited to run our organization. Sometimes there's embezzlement involved.
Right.
A lot of times, if we are abdicating rather than delegating, then we find ourselves in trouble.
Perfect. And you just gave me some new vocabulary because I didn't even realize what to call this. And I read E-Myth a while ago. I haven't dived back into it. I like that abdication versus delegation.
Right.
Okay, so now we'll go back to the original question. So practice ownership isn't for everyone, and that's okay. And you don't have to be a practice owner. There's plenty of ways to be a dentist. But is it still worth it for those who want to be practice owner? Or are the forces arrayed against us in terms of insurance and corporate and all the pressures that are going on, and student loans? Is it worth the extra debt and risk if I'm invested to be a practice owner? And why?
Okay, great question. And I would have to say, absolutely yes. I believe that it's definitely worth it. I still think there's a lot of blue ocean out there for people that want to own their own dental practice. But I'm going to come back. It's going to sound like I'm beating the same drum with every question. You've got to educate yourself. You have to know the basics of business. You have to know how to read a balance sheet and a P&L. You have to understand how overhead and profitability works. See, I talk to people all the time that are so obsessed with this notion of, I'm not going to work for peanuts. I'm not going to work for PPO fees. Dentistry's falling apart. You can't be profitable.
The sky is falling.
Yeah, the sky is falling. You can't be profitable at this level. Well, I'm on my 8th practice now,
right?
And I've only had PPO practices. Some of the practices we've accepted Medicaid, so I know how to be profitable with very, very low reimbursement fees in comparison to what people think is reasonable.
Right.
And that is not because I'm faster, and that's not because my offices are mills. It's because we understand the basics of business, and we understand how to keep expenses under control. We understand how to be profitable. We understand about systemization and marketing and those sorts of things. If you educate yourself in the areas that any small business owner needs to be educated in, then absolutely, there's still lots of opportunity to have wildly successful dental practices, even for today's recent graduates.
Okay, awesome. And you're just setting me up great, because that's the whole point of both your podcast and my podcast, is to lay out a journey and education for people, not so that they can do and run every facet of their business themselves, but so they can intelligently hire and create systems and put together a practice that, yes, allows them to focus on the clinical dentistry and allows them to be profitable despite competition, despite insurance. So this is awesome. It's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you. I'll send you the check afterwards. But why is it worth it? So why is practice ownership worth it? What are you seeing as like the best reasons? Is it more money? Is it more freedom? Is it control? What makes practice ownership worth the extra effort to be an entrepreneur on top of being a dentist?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot more liberty to control your own destiny, really. So let's start with the most obvious benefit. The most obvious benefit is that if you purchase a practice, you're going to owe a certain amount of money at the purchase or at the startup.
Okay.
Either way, you're going to owe a certain amount of money for the acquisition of this asset. Now, as you're working in this asset as an owner now, everything that you do is going to be building value into this asset. So every incremental increase in production collections over the years is more equity in this business. So if you think of it as in the real estate model, every year, every day that you're in your house that you own, you're paying down that mortgage and the principal of what you owe for that. At the end of that, rather than throwing your money away in rent over 30 years, you're actually going to have a tangible asset that you own. It's going to be paid for, and you can exit that asset by selling it, or you can live in it for the rest of your life, right?
Right.
You pass it on to your heirs, and they can do with what they want with it. The same is true with a business. So, you build up a certain amount of money within your business, and let's interject another factor or variable into this.
Okay.
Let's just say a really well-paid associate is making 30% of their production. So if they do $3,000 production for one day. They're
Sure.
going to make $900 before taxes.
Okay.
And then there'll be some lab fees. And I think that's pretty fair for a good compensation for a good associate.
Right.
Now, if you're running a very, very tight business yourself, say you have 50% overhead. Okay. So overhead in my definition would be payroll plus all of the operating expenses, not including the doctor salary.
Compensation. Okay.
Doctor compensation. Okay. So you're looking at, say, most of my practices that I own run at 50% overhead. So let's just say 25% goes to payroll, 25% goes into operating expenses. The doctors, let's just say it's the owner doctor, it's a solo owner doctor is making 30%.
Okay.
Right. So he's still making that $900 for that $300 day. But in addition to that,
and that's because you structure it so that he's paying himself out of the business that 30%.
As if he was an associate.
As if he was an associate. Okay.
Correct. And then in addition to that, that doctor is still receiving an additional 20% for everything else that happens at that practice. It could be 20% off another associate that's working at the practice. It could be 20% off 3 full-time hygienists at the practice. Now, an associate dentist would never see that benefit.
Right.
So there's a double benefit there. The owner doctor gets whatever they produce, a percentage of that. They get profit, plus they get this tangible asset that's growing in value and equity over time. And by nature, you're paying down the debt on that. Someday at the end of this doctor's career, they're going to have all the money that they accumulated in addition to the associate doctor in profit. And they're going to have this tangible asset that they could either pass on to their heirs, sell for a large lump sum, put an associate in perhaps, and just get that 20% for the rest of his life or his heir's life. So there's a lot of benefits to financially to owning a dental practice versus associating. Now, if you're a multiple practice owner, I'm on my 8th. I'm hoping to pick up 5 more this year.
Oh yeah, just pick up 5 more practices in a year. No big deal.
Yeah. We can multiply that benefit exponentially.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of what I think are the biggest benefits of, associating versus owning.
Well, and that there's a couple points there that I love, and the first part is building that asset. And I think Reese Harper on the Dentist Money podcast recently made the point that say you sell your practice for $500,000, $600,000 at the end of your career, and you pay capital gains tax on that sale, which is a more favorable tax situation than almost any other income that you make. Right now, that's 20%. Who knows what it'll be when we sell our practices and someday in the future. But that money, you might say like, oh, well, compared to what you need for retirement, that might not be everything that you hoped it was if you're looking to retire off that. That's not going to get you there. You're still going to have to save. However, he made the point of think of how many years of being an associate or being a doctor and saving that would take to get you to that $500,000, $600,000 minus taxes. And so if that could be 10 years of savings that you just pulled out of that asset in that sale right there.
Absolutely.
If you were saving $50,000 a year, which is a fairly, depending on where you at in your career, that could be a fairly aggressive savings rate. And then the associate production, the hygienist, the profit, all of those reasons, that's awesome. So with that, say that we want to be an owner. We've just graduated. We have $400,000 of student loans. How do I get there? What's the A to Z pathway of, do I buy straight out of school? Do I go and become an associate? And for how long? And what do I need to have saved before I buy a practice? What would be some initial steps that someone straight out of school could take to get ready for practice ownership in either an acquisition or a startup? Either way, we won't go into that, but what would be some recommendations that you would have? What kind of job should they look for? And all of that. That was like 12 questions in one, so I'm sorry. I'll let you address any of those that you want to. You don't have to hit them all.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I'm picturing myself a new grad, $350,000 in debt.
Right.
$400,000.
We're gonna say 400. I'm coming from Midwestern in Phoenix, and it's straight up over 400. So I'm talking to all my classmates here.
Oh my gosh. So it is a big hole. It's a big hole to pull yourself out of. So here's my first bit of advice.
Okay, don't worry. We're gonna get to his advice in a second, but first, a quick word from our sponsor, Q Optics. Okay, I got to take something back that I said in the last ad. I said that your neck hurts because you're looking over the top of your loops more than your angle of declination. Really, it's all of it together. And the angle of declination really does matter. And in fact, I said if I want as much as possible, they said, okay, let's go with 50. You don't want to go with 60, that's too much. Let's do 50. And it's been awesome. It's been great. But now I want to look at, how do you diagnose if your loops aren't working for you? And for me, the biggest sign is if my neck and my upper mid back, kind of between my scapula and my spine, hurts. And you get these tight knots. They're called trigger points. And if you're right-handed and the right side of your back from the base of your skull down to your scapula to your upper shoulder hurts and is tight and has knots, it probably means you're bending over too much. You're craning too much. Something else that can help with your ergonomics, not only is magnification and loops in general going to help, but your working distance can push you back and up. It can retrain you. So getting a new pair of loops can also be an opportunity to learn how to sit better. If you push it out a few inches, your working distance, at first it's going to be a little unnatural. You're going to be kind of leaning in like you normally did, and then you realize, oh, I'm too close. But over time, you train and you adjust, and your muscles learn how to sit up straight. So this is an ideal time to correct some of your bad habits and take your ergonomics to the next level. For $100 off a pair of loops or $300 off loops and light combo, email sales@QOptics with the promo code SP16. QOptics, your next favorite pair of loops.
It's a big hole to pull yourself out of. So here's my first bit of advice. Well, the banks aren't going to let you buy a practice right out of the gate anyway.
Okay.
So they're gonna prevent you from doing that. But what to do in the meantime? Say it's a 2-year, which the banks are preferring nowadays. They want 2 years work experience prior to giving you a loan for either a startup or the acquisition of a dental practice.
Okay.
Okay. So the banks are looking for at least 2 years experience. So what to do in that 2 years? What must happen in that 2 years so that you are fit to purchase and run a practice
Perfect.
at that 2-year mark?
Yeah,
okay?
exactly.
So what you're looking for is some sort of financial residency, some sort of business residency. So you could potentially get that in a group practice model, but probably not. So,
okay.
But that doesn't mean you can't work there. You're going to have to do a lot of self-education. Now, the cool thing is that there's more free resources than ever, as you know, Richard.
Right.
Because you're putting out a great free resource right now on how to educate yourself and how to prepare yourself for business ownership. You gotta literally marinate yourself in resources like this and other podcasts and anything you can get your hands on as far as just general business books like E-Myth Revisited,
right.
The Ultimate Sales Machine by Chet Holmes, anything by Napoleon Hill for mindset stuff. All those things must
keep going.
place.
I'm gonna write these down and put them in the show notes. Any other business books that you recommend to any new grad? Like, you must read one of these.
Okay, so everybody, when you become a client of mine, you must read 3 books before we start our coaching.
Perfect.
Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink.
Okay.
The next one is The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber.
Awesome.
And then the last one for customer service is The Fred Factor.
Huh. Okay. I haven't heard of 2 of those. I'm going to go read them.
So those are 3 books that are required reading for all of my clients. And then I would say required reading for anybody that's about to be a business owner or is in that marination period that's happening in that 2 years post-graduation.
Right.
So, I mean, if you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, that'd be great. I was lucky enough to get hired by a guy that I went to school with, graduated 3 years before me. He was a legend back to all of us back at school because people said he was doing great. He was driving a Porsche.
Right.
He had 2 practices, all that stuff that we think is important when we're back in dental school.
Sure.
So I was lucky enough to get hired as his lead associate at one of his practices. And what I did during that time was I said, okay, I'm really lucky to be an associate with him. He guaranteed me $120,000 or whatever. But more important than that, I didn't focus as much on that than I did that I was going to be alone by myself in this practice.
Mm.
And I was going to use that as my financial residency year.
Okay.
So I stayed after and I picked the office manager's brain. I was the biggest pain in the butt.
Right.
I learned how to put in insurance claims. I learned the difference between an HMO, PPO, a Medicaid claim. I understood the difference between collections percentage and producing percentage, new patients, active patients, patients that were active in hygiene. I learned all of those things that first year out. So when I got out of that first year and I applied for my loan for my very first practice, I felt confident that I at least not, go out of business because I knew the basics.
Right. Well,
And
and
then
I think that example is so good because it shows that no one set this financial residency up for you. And by being an associate in this practice, that didn't mean you learned these things. You had to be obnoxious. You had to go ask questions and look over people's shoulders and say, hey, can I do that? Or how do you do this? Or what happens when this goes wrong? And create that for yourself. And so one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast was that I realized I'm not getting any of this as a military dentist right now. And I've got 5 more years of commitment to the Army, and that's great. And I'm not going to get exposed to any of these. However, I also realized a lot of my classmates who are in corporate chains or dental offices, unless they're doing that for themselves and reaching out and trying to absorb everything they can, they're not getting it either. You don't get this by osmosis. Just by being in the chair doing the crowns and the fillings, you don't by default learn how to run a successful dental practice. And sometimes the practice you're in might not be doing it the best way, and even if they're doing it a way that works, then you've learned one way to do it, but that doesn't have to be how you do it in your future practice. Now that's just one point of reference. So I want to get as many points of reference of saying, here's 5 different ways to do it. Now you understand why you do it these different ways. Let's figure out what you want in your practice. So to come back to this, sorry, I went on a rant. I got to cut myself off sometimes.
That was actually very, very good. I like that rant.
Well, thank you. So you created yourself a little residency, and that allowed you to go to the bank and prove your production, and it gave you the confidence that you knew how to run a dental practice at its most basic. And even though it wasn't perfect, I'm sure, and you were still learning along the way, and I'm sure you know now much better than you knew then the best way to do X, Y, and Z. You had that foundation. In terms of production and deciding how big of a practice to buy, what would be a good goal of trying to produce in your first year or 2 as an associate to then set yourself up to be able to buy the right size practice to be profitable and successful, if that makes any sense? So like, say I'm guaranteed $500 a day, but I get 30% of production or collections or whatever my contract says. Is $2,000 a day, if I can consistently produce $2,000 a day, is that enough to turn around and say to the bank, hey, I can be a good dentist, give me a loan for this practice that I want to buy? And will they take, is that enough production, about $4,800 a year or $480,000 a year? Is that enough to buy a practice with? Or would you recommend more? Or what would be some minimums and targets and goals that people could shoot for?
So are we talking about the bank vetting you or you vetting the actual practice, which practice to purchase?
I'm talking about if the bank is vetting you based on your production as an associate, because in some ways that's your creditworthiness to the bank, your ability to produce as a dentist. And what would be a good minimum? Because if I'm looking at a practice and they aren't going to give me enough production, and I'm just going to be collecting my $500 guarantee, and I only produce $1,200 a day because they didn't have enough patients for me. And then I turn around and go to the bank and say, hey, I want a loan for a practice. Is the bank going to say, well, you didn't produce enough this last year to buy this big of a practice? Am I making any sense? If not, I'll totally just go back and edit all this out.
No, you're making sense. I know that the bank, I can't pretend to be able to think like an underwriter,
Sure,
because I've tried to figure out how they think for the last 15 years.
It's been, I'm sure, frustrating at times. You're like, I can prove that I can make this work. Please, let's do this loan. Let's make you guys some money, but they don't want to.
Exactly. So I can't pretend to know how an underwriter thinks.
Okay.
But if I were the underwriter, I would say between $2,000 and $4,000 per day on average would be sufficient proof that you are a strong enough producer that you could handle production of X practice, right? Okay, so that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, or I'm going to turn this into a two-part question.
I love it.
When you're searching for a practice, what type of production should you be looking for?
There we go.
To make it worthwhile, to make a purchase worthwhile. Now, I think that you just walked into one of the main traps that most dentists fall into, and that is focusing on production. What I would like to see is, when I'm looking for a practice, I'm looking for actually the overhead and the profitability of a practice, because I do this presentation when I'm on stage a lot of times, called The Tale of Two Practices. And this is actually from two separate real clients of mine. Obviously, I don't divulge the name.
Sure.
But one is a $750,000 practice that generates $750,000 in collections every year. One is a $1.6 million practice generating $1.6 million a year. The $1.6 million practice has a 76% overhead, and the $750,000 practice has a 50% overhead. So who do you think takes more money home?
It's got to be pretty close. I can't do the math right now.
Well, in this particular case, I didn't get the percentages exactly right.
Sure.
In this particular case, the $750,000 practice owner is making $175,000 more than the $1.6 million practice
Oh my
owner.
goodness.
So if you're going to be purchasing an asset, you need to look at how much take home you're going to be making, not necessarily the gross receipts from that particular practice.
Okay.
So when I'm going out and I'm looking for practices, I don't necessarily see a practice that's got 90% overhead as a bad thing if it is reasonably priced. See, the bank will not lend me money on a practice that is got 92% overhead.
Okay.
I'm looking at one right now. I'm
Okay.
looking at one right now. But if I'm looking at the P&Ls and I say, oh, he's running 2 cars through this, that's not going to happen after I own it.
Sure.
Oh, his payroll is 47% of his revenue. Well, I could easily, adjust that by removing those senior players on the team. I know it sounds cold-hearted, but getting a more reasonably priced front office person.
Well, and maybe his wife is one of those front office people.
In this case, she happens to be.
Okay.
I'm not going to be paying for all of his health insurance, which now the practice is paying for. I'm not going to be paying for all of his subscriptions to all of his different associations, which now the practice is paying for.
Right.
So if I can eliminate 40% of this 92% overhead with the snap of a finger after I purchase this, then that becomes a good buy. But that gives me a lot of bargaining power to say, the bank won't finance this. You need to hold paper on this. I'll put 10% down and let's make this deal happen. That dentist, on this particular deal, sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here.
No, I love these rabbit holes. Keep going.
So this particular dentist has had this practice on the market. Nobody can qualify for a loan for this because his numbers look so wonky. But I know that gives me enough leverage to say, you hold paper, I'll put a small percent down. You have to stay for 3 years. I'm probably going to get a new staff. If you're okay with all these parameters, here's a full price offer.
Oh, wow. So, okay. And no one else can give that to him because it's not lendable.
It's not lendable. And nobody else is creative enough to say to
really look at the numbers and realize, okay, yes, it says there's a 93% overhead, but if you do the accounting right, instead of doing his creative accounting, then there's a lot of room for improvement here.
Yeah, and what kills me is that the broker of his is also happens to be a dental consultant, and it's been on the market for 3 years. Why couldn't the consultant say, hey, why don't we just pay all of these things as a draw or as owner's compensation so as not to increase the overhead by 40%?
Well, and shouldn't, like, that blows my mind. Like, can't you account for that and then price it correctly
and then perhaps get multiple offers that the bank will lend on.
right.
So
That's frustrating.
I look at this thing.
Well,
and
it's
I'm
great
like,
for
oh,
you.
This thing is totally broken, but I can fix
You
it
can
in
fix
2
it.
days. Yeah.
And you have to understand what these things are that are broken to be able to realize how good of a deal and goldmine this is.
Exactly.
So, awesome. Well, I think that kind of wraps up the questions that I want to ask you of advice for a new grad who wants to move towards ownership and needs kind of a pathway to get there. So thank you so much for answering all that and kind of giving a unique perspective on this is a game plan of, okay, 2 years, produce $2,000 to $4,000, create a financial residency for yourself by being an obnoxious associate and asking all of the questions that they're like, well, why are you asking this? This doesn't matter to you. Just go do the MOD. But you want to know and you have to know, and you're not going to find out unless you go in and see it, how it actually works. Right. And I love that perspective. So thank you so much for your time and for answering all of our rabbit hole questions. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure to be here.
Thanks. See ya. Okay, what an awesome interview. I love Dr. Costes, and I hope to, and I plan to, and he said he's willing to have him on for every single season because he's got experience in all of these areas, has multiple practices, lectures and teaches and interacts with people who know what they're doing. Grateful he's willing to kind of be one of our keystone guests. If you want the books that he mentioned, those will be in the show notes. And they're actually affiliate links. So if you click on the link that we have down in the description of this show, it'll support the show if you buy the book through that link. It'll give us like 3 pennies or something. I don't know. The percentages, we haven't actually had anyone use any of our links to Amazon for an affiliate link. I think it's 4% of a $10 book. So on second thought, screw it. It really doesn't matter that much. More importantly, if you could leave us a review or share with a friend, that would do way more to help our show than buying through our affiliate link. Okay, and lastly, if you work at a corporate chain, know someone who has, and want to contribute to our review of corporate experiences guide that we're going to create, please email me, richard@sharedpractices.com. Thank you, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.